Welcome to a special episode of Talking Feds. As longtime listeners know, this podcast began with a special focus on federal criminal law enforcement, and from our very first days, we have taped special episodes on the Department of Justice every few months. We weren't planning to do another DOJ report card episode this week, but then the department undertook a flurry of actions, each of which is a corrupt gift wrap present to Donald Trump and his bottomless thirst for retribution against his perceived enemies. Just in the past week, news broke that DOJ officials were putting together a grand jury to hear evidence against the Obama administration. And we're going after Senator Adam Schiff and New York Attorney General Letitia James for mortgage fraud. And we're subpoenaing James's office with a possible eye toward charging her for, get this, violating Trump's civil rights by beating him in court. The wheels are now completely off at the DOJ. As an investigative agency, it has become indistinguishable from the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation or the Office of the Prosecutor General in Hungary, both undisguised hit squads for their presidents. We can now only wonder whether the department will follow through with a series of bogus prosecutions of former government and political officials, the likes of which have never been seen in the United States. And the department's full embrace of its role as Trump's avengers has implications for other political battles, including the response to the new congressional subpoena to the department for Jeffrey Epstein records. To try to make sense of a Department of Justice that daily seems to be undertaking more dramatic transgressions from its lawful and traditional role, and to be transforming itself into the nation's largest law firm dedicated to the political fortunes of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, we're really pleased to welcome three of the most knowledgeable commentators on the department in the country, two of whom I'm really pleased to say are first-time guests on Talking Feds. And they are not a first-time guest, Kristy Greenberg, the former deputy chief of the criminal division in the Southern District of New York. As you probably know, she appears regularly on MSNBC as a legal analyst. As you may not know, because it's spanking new, she hosts her own new legal affairs show on YouTube called Courtside with Kristy Greenberg. Congrats on that. We should all definitely subscribe. And welcome, as always, Kristy Greenberg.
Thank you. Thank you.
Perry Stein, a longtime reporter on the DOJ and FBI beat for the Washington Post, before which she wrote for the Washington City paper and the Miami Herald. First-time guest. So glad to see you, Perry Stein.
Thanks so much for having me.
And Glenn Thrush, who also reports on the Justice Department for the New York Times, and he's a contributor to MSNBC, and he previously covered politics as chief political correspondent at Politico. I've been on with him a few times and have been very eager to have him on the show. Been on with him on cable. So pleasure to welcome you, Glenn. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
I'd like to start down the street from the department where hours ago a panel of the D.C. Circuit vacated by 2-1 the order by Judge Jeb Boasberg of probable cause to find contempt for the administration's conduct way back on March 15th. Boasberg has been the face so far of challenging DOJ recalcitrance. Sort of unusual. He's a judge's judge, respected on all sides of the aisle, even though he gets trashed by the administration. But he doggedly insisted on going through contempt proceedings. What impact do you see politically and culturally to the decision to just shut him down?
Just on the basic thing, I think that, as you said, this was a good test to see if these prosecutors will be held accountable for, controversial interpretations of judges' rulings, right? I mean, this was one that obviously the administration felt very justified in how they read it, but many other people disagreed, and this was a good test to see if they would be held accountable. So you could see this. Now, this is obviously speculation, changing the administration's calculations and whether they take kind of not politically conservative, but conservative interpretations of judges' orders or how they view it. So yeah, I think this was a big test.
Let me just add one thing and then serve it up to Kristy and Glenn, which is all that Boasberg was doing was gathering facts. So you're maybe right, Perry, that you could have two ways of looking at it. But I mean, we know from Beauvais' confirmation, there were 3 whistleblowers who came in and said he flat out told people to disobey orders. And what Boasberg was about was figuring that out. And that's the process that's been arrested. So it could have been he arrived at a place where, and inconveniently enough, with now Third Circuit Judge Beauvais, to actually find it as a, objective fact. And that process has now been aborted.
What's really interesting about this is just how far down the track we are. Things are moving so quickly. The central character in this is Émile Beauvais, who seems to have been there for 1,000 years, but really only 4.5 or 5 months, is now sitting on the bench. The velocity of all of this is just remarkable. And I agree with everything that Perry said. I would add one thing, and that is we have now gotten to the point where it is so firmly established that the administration has essentially declared war on any federal judge that deigns to oppose them and is willing to defy them, that this, I think, represents, as have Supreme Court decisions, a permission structure that is going to embolden them to continue this kind of behavior going forward, whether or not Beauvais is in the building or not. And I think even had this proceeded, I don't think there's really any counterforce yet, any countermeasure, judicial or otherwise, that is dissuading this administration or this administration working through the agency of the Department of Justice from doing whatever the hell they want to do.
So I think it's such an important point, and now that's the narrative. Boasberg, such rectitude, such care, such meticulousness. That's the only way they could get to a mandamus. He's now really been slapped around. Bondi has already served up a ridiculous complaint to try to discipline him, and in it she just says, as a fact, as a Orwellian fact, we've never tried to violate rules. And so if that narrative holds, it really does embolden them, it seems to me, to do whatever they like. And this was the best opportunity to play that narrative out.
Just a few thoughts. So one on what you just mentioned, the fact that Pam Bondi has brought a complaint against Judge Boasberg. I find that not only the content of the complaint to be disingenuous, but the timing is really curious. The comments that were at issue from Judge Boasberg, he made those at a private conference back in March. This complaint from DOJ was only brought in July after Judge Boasberg said during a conference in this case that he was considering whether or not he would refer any attorneys for potential disciplinary misconduct hearings to their local state bar associations, attorney grievance committees. Only at that point did she then decide to move forward with misconduct. It seems clearly retaliatory to me, and nothing that he said in that conference about just raising concerns that I think all judges have and that many in the public have had about this Department of Justice not following judicial orders. Raising that concern is clearly not misconduct. That's just stating facts. That's just making an observation that other people are making. As to this opinion, I mean, everything that has led up to this has been so improper. Looking at these judges, the idea that they can parse with, what does remove mean? We have to go to the dictionary to figure out what did his order mean and was it clear? It was clear. It was very clear. If you look at the transcript, if you look at what Judge Boasberg
Turn those
said,
planes around, right?
Yeah, turn the planes around. Hey, you guys have secretly loaded these flights with people in the middle of the night to try and avoid any kind of order to ship them off to a foreign gulag where they'd have no ability to have any due process. And so don't let them off the plane, because once they're off the plane, you're going to say they're not in your custody anymore. He couldn't have been more clear if you looked at the context of his remarks, what he meant. And even more importantly, the whistleblowers, not only the whistleblower complaint that we saw, but the communications that he had to back it up. they all understood what the order meant. It was very clear they understood what it meant. And they said, hey, he's following up. Bovee had the exchange the day before of, hey, we may need to consider telling the courts, F you. And then the next day, when they're essentially telling Judge Boasberg F you and letting people off the planes, now Judge Bovee was the one who gave that very explicit order, according to these emails to Department of Homeland Security. Yeah, go ahead, let them off the planes, directly contradicting what Judge Boasberg had said. The DOJ attorneys, as they are messaging each other discussing that, are saying this is the FU. They know what it means. Everybody understood what it meant. So the idea that these judges now on the DC circuit are trying to act like this was ambiguous and nobody would have understood what it meant, everybody understood what it meant. And putting that aside, whether or not the order was clear or not, or they thought it was wrongfully ordered or not, as you said, Harry, at this stage, all the judge was doing was seeking to gather facts to figure out what happened, who it was who defied his orders, who is the Colonel Jessup who gave the code red here. He's just trying to find information, trying to gather facts. And the fact that they would step in now and put it on an administrative hold for months.
Right. That's supposed to be a couple of days, right?
Couple of days when you've got Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who in another case said 2 weeks is too long for an administrative stay. So the fact that they held on to this, I don't see any way to see it other than a political ploy to protect Bovee during his judicial confirmation process. That's clearly what this was. This is politics at its worst.
Such a great point. And look, it's just disheartening. You use the word ambiguous, which they're trying to seize on. That's a sort of common ploy. Make something that's clear and just try to get it to ambiguity. My concern now, and why I am sort of disheartened, is what had been a clean litmus test. Now I think potentially, no matter what happens in the law, is at its very best muddled. So my question to you guys is, do you think that as a sort of clean line of attack against the putative lawlessness of the administration, no matter what happens going forward in this case, this scenario, this episode has been sort of taken away from the opposition?
Look, man, the fact set on this is going to continue to come out. So it depends on the environment that we're existing in.
Why? I don't know if it will.
Well, I think it will, because more and more people who are involved in this are going to be either kicked out of the department, or their tongues are going to be loosened, or we're going to be moving closer into a midterm environment in which Democrats become more empowered by retaining the majority, or more empowered by being completely marginalized. So I think you're going to see people there was this period of time, as we know, at the beginning of the administration, when they were doing the attacks on the law firms, when we saw this recoiling. I think we're seeing a little bit less of it now. People are not growing congressional medals of honor here, but I do have a general sense that there is a feeling that there are ways to fight back, and that is by injecting facts. And we continue, and Perry can attest to this as well. I think over the past 6 weeks or so, we have definitely seen a loosening of sources' willingness to disclose things that were occurring at that period of time that they considered to be problematic. So,
very interesting. Yeah.
On one hand, as the Abrego Garcia case moves down the chain and we get some sort of a resolution, and we should say we really don't know what the heck that's going to be, I do think the gradual release of information, and even more information, I think we're going to hear about Bovee's behavior inside the department when he was running things. So I think in terms of a political and cultural fact set, we're going to hear a lot more as time goes on. But here's the big question. We're in such a blizzard of information and disinformation. And the president of the United States and his hirelings control the spigot. Look at today alone. I don't even want to go on my homepage. At one point in time, I did I counted the headlines that had the word Trump in them, and there was like 14 of them. So he controls the capacity to disorient. And so the question isn't whether or not we're going to find out more about the Ruvani, Abrego Garcia, Boasberg triangle and all of that stuff. The question is, are we going to be so far up the road that we have 10 larger crises to cope with? I think that's always the question in the Trump era. It's not about whether or not we're going to find out stuff. It's just, are we going to be so overwhelmed, this is going to go down the memory hole?
I agree with Glenn. Obviously, we're seeing that things are working very differently in this administration. I think that the courts as you mentioned, are one way of which we can find out what happened. And obviously, this decision makes this avenue to figure it out much less likely at the very least. And it's an important avenue, right? The courts are supposed to be a separate branch of government. So it's supposed to be an objective looking at it. But as Glenn said, I mean, in this specific instance, it doesn't mean it's necessarily the end for the public to find out what happened. Obviously, you have at least the Dems in Congress very focused on this incident. It was really related to Beauvai's confirmation, but I'm sure they haven't lost steam on that. But as Glenn said, there's so much stuff happening that it's, as a reporter, I think each of these stories in different times would consume all of our attention and reporting resources because they are such notable tests. But there's just so much going on. I mean, the number of stories that I'm sure Glenn and I have bylines on this week alone is a big deal. So my point in saying that is that it doesn't mean that this test won't come up again.
But I mean, this week alone, let's try this morning alone on the blizzard. And, two other big things have happened today. The appointment of Ed Martin Jr. going after Letitia James and Adam Schiff, so real enemies of the state, as it were. And then subpoenas sent by one of the most partisan of Trump, not even U.S. attorneys, special attorneys, because he couldn't be confirmed, against two different things that James was doing. So I think this velocity point is so important when you talk about the political and cultural impact. It's just like sort of gets absorbed and encapsulated. But can we take a minute or two on another big story? I'm sure you'll be unpacking all weekend. The clear attacks on both James and Schiff. Where the hell is this all coming from? Is this Bondi? Is it higher up Steve Miller? Because we started the administration with a sort of shock and awe campaign overall. But now we're seeing shock and awe from just the Department of Justice in just the last few weeks.
I think it's fair to say what we know about these investigations into Letitia James so far are particularly unusual investigations. And I do think that it is, safe to say that they reflect a big escalation in the Justice Department, the tools that they're willing to use to go after people that they feel have done wrong by the president and his allies.
Kristy, he's the victim here. I want to serve this up to you as a legal theory. The theory of the investigation against James, one of the two, is deprivation of civil rights, the same kind of lawsuits we see against officers who use excessive force. But what happened here? And this is a civil case she won in New York, but it's somehow a deprivation of civil rights because it was targeted at Donald Trump. How in the world can any political appointee of Donald Trump be within 10 miles of doing this investigation where he is the victim? Any thoughts there as a DOJ alumna?
I mean, I don't quite understand their theory, but maybe I'm not supposed to. Because at the end of the day, I'm not sure that the goal here is to actually prosecute anyone. Using the tools at your disposal to investigate people, you can cause a lot of damage that way. You can harass people. You can cause people to have to, hire attorneys, to have to deal with discovery. And that can be time consuming. That can be, financially draining. They're all the things. And it can result in leaks that can damage someone's reputation. But does it actually translate into a concrete charge that can be brought in a prosecution and in a court of law? I don't see it. But somebody like Ed Martin, I mean, this is somebody who is never a prosecutor. We're seeing people who are being put in charge of these U.S. attorneys' offices around the country who have no experience as prosecutors. And it takes a while. There is a learning curve to being a prosecutor. I spent some time as a chief for new AUSAs. That is a steep learning curve. And so I really don't know if the prosecution is the point or if it's everything else that comes with an investigation and the hoopla and what I have now been referring to as the national inquirification of the Department of Justice, where we don't necessarily need to make a case. We just leak things. And we are just there to, attack political enemies. The kind of the David Pecker, the three things we learned, Harry, you and I, sitting through the Trump trial last year. He was the eyes and ears of Trump, and for the campaign, he would attack the political enemies of Trump. And he would also serve to catch and kill any damaging stories about Trump. And it seems like this Department of Justice is doing that, is kind of employing that David Pecker playbook and putting that into how the Justice Department operates, which, of course, none of those things are things that normally the Department of Justice would do. You only are supposed to bring, in particular, a case against any public official that really has a strong predicate. And the people, to your point, Harry, who are bringing those cases are supposed to be independent, or not supposed to have any sort of even indicia that they may have some bias that's driving them. I recall being at SDNY, and it was always the saying, we operate without fear or favor. And now these days, it seems like there's plenty of fear. People are afraid based on what cases they're on, whether it was January 6th or just you were prosecuting a case of somebody who is a Trump donor, you can find yourself fired. And then in terms of the favor, yes, it seems like there's plenty of favorable treatment that's being given to Donald Trump allies, cases being dropped, left and right against people who may be aligned with him in some way. So it's a really fraught time. This is not a Department of Justice that is operating in a way that at all resembles how I recall doing the job. And I know that it has to, when you see these firings of career FBI agents and of career prosecutors, people who were doing the best jobs, really doing such good work, like Maureen Comey stands to mind just because she's somebody I had worked with, who was an extraordinary prosecutor. When you see those people getting fired and you see people who have no experience doing these jobs in these places where they are now wielding enormous power, it is scary. And it's also scary when there's no accountability. When people seem to be violating court orders and then you can't even hold them in contempt of court, you can't even hold them to discipline. Really, at that point, when there's no accountability for it and you violate a law, you violate a court order, and it gets you a place on the bench, the incentives here are all skewed, and it really doesn't bode well for the rule of law going forward.
The one thing I would say is all of you are incredibly disadvantaged by not having covered the 2016 Trump campaign. You have an expectation of rationality here and of also sort of institutional insulation and respect for these institutions. Kristy laid it out better than I possibly could. But we are playing, you got to throw out any notion of justice manual or adhering to norms or even sort of placing competent individuals in positions of authority. That's not the way we're doing this. I mean, we're also talking on an afternoon where Trump just fired his IRS commissioner after 2 months on the job. It's the 6th IRS commissioner. I mean, this is about impulse control. You have maybe a half a dozen people at the top of this Justice Department that are making really substantive decisions, and like 5 of them are named Todd Blanche. So it's a situation, I think, in which there is absolutely no barrier between the White House in terms of transmitting political direction and what the department is going to do. It is my general sense that Blanche is attempting on some issues to provide some sort of a buffer to keep things from getting too far out of control. But all bets are off. So 2 things. First of all, let's talk about Donald Trump told you what he was going to do. Perry and I had to sit through Trump's speech. When was it? In March? In which he literally stood in the Great Hall where Justice Jackson gave his famous speech defining the role of a federal prosecutor, right? And he called his enemies scum while his attorney general and deputy attorney general, Harry is collapsing in his chair, folks, while they were standing nearby and nodding their heads. I mean, like, he told you what he was going to do, guys. Hello. And then the other part of this is Ed Martin says the loud part louder. So Ed Martin literally said that the purpose of these investigations isn't necessarily to achieve an indictment, much less a conviction, but to shame people. I'm relatively new to the beat, only been on it 2.5 years. I can't find the shame part in the Justice Manual. Can you guys direct me to that subsection, please?
It's not just shame. So Martin is now going to oversee supposed mortgage fraud investigations against James and Adam Schiff. And it's going to be money, it's going to be defense lawyers, it's going to be reputational harm, and it's going to be shame. I have a follow-up question then. Let me start at that March meeting. It was like, how the hell did they fill the place to listen to Donald Trump? I couldn't believe it. I know the answer. They brought in political folks from around the country, regular career prosecutors not permitted. Glenn and Perry, you've said actually, as the horrors have proliferated, that your sources are being a little looser than they otherwise would be. What is your sense of the growing discontent or not, growing fear or not, growing contempt or not of the career staff within DOJ and to these, what I think Kristy has described accurately as abominations of the DOJ traditional role and the codes of conduct that every prosecutor in that building who got there before January was schooled in?
I can speak to a story that I recently reported about the career officials here. I think that there is a very unprecedented, I know this is now overused, but like a culture of real fear there, right? You're having firings fairly at random. And look, the Justice Department is 100,000 people when you include the FBI. So obviously, most people haven't been fired, right? You have a lot of people that have taken the riff. You've had a lot of people who have opted to leave, and there have been people who have been pushed out. But what we're seeing now is kind of these one-off firings, is what I'm calling them. People that may have worked on a certain case, or who knows why they got fired, and they're not being really told. And it's often coming from the highest levels of the Justice Department, where even their bosses, sometimes those bosses are lower level political appointees, don't know about their firing. So what it's doing is really, I think, making people kind of wobbly on their feet, very distrustful, kind of looking behind their backs, a lot of people are willing to serve in this administration if they feel they can do good work and do their work. And I think a lot of people served in the first Trump administration and know that the politics change between administration, and, people I've talked to are open to that. Some people are were happy with Trump one's term and were happy for a repeat, in terms of how Justice Department operated. And so you're seeing just kind of rampant speculation about, wait, why was this person fired? Were they fired for this reason? Did I do that? And so I can't read into people's minds to know the intent of what DOJ is trying to do, but it has certainly created a total mistrust, even among people who have been perceived as people that could be good attorneys within this administration.
To just piggyback on Perry's point, her story, if you haven't read it, is exceptional. Erez Ruveni, who's become the poster child in this battle with Bove over the Abrego Garcia case, who represented the government in it, and made the sin of admitting in court that they had mistakenly deported him, was totally, I don't know what his personal opinions are, but he was praised for his work on the sanctuary cities stuff. So this was a career Justice Department staffer who was generally on board with the immigration crackdown and seemed willing and was praised by his superiors and given a promotion for acting in the interests of the political leadership of the department in the second Trump administration. And he got canned.
After 15 years, and what about the woman whose one sin was being appointed the acting U.S. attorney by the judges in New Jersey? There's a real brutality and kind of callousness. All right, so we've had, again, the word that sticks with me from our whole discussion is velocity, or blizzard, as Glenn put it. Something we didn't even mention is that Jack Smith's been served up for investigation by the Office of Special Counsel. But we have that. We have, all the enemies list, Letitia James, Obama of all people, and now Schiff. Maybe this is just inscrutable, but some of these I think are, as Kristy said, just theatrical. We're gonna, get to dirty them up a little, etc. But I think there are a few people, and I'll add to this the subpoena by the House of figures like Merrick Garland and Loretta Lynch. So this is all really bad, really irregular. But do you think we're going to see political enemies and predecessors in the dock? Are we going to see U.S. versus Obama, U.S. versus Lynch, U.S. versus Schiff, U.S. versus James, or is it all kind of theater?
two things I wanted to bring up. One is, I think, as everyone has put in a lot of their stories, there's so many legal hurdles, right?
Right.
I mean, we didn't even talk here about grand juries, right? We don't know, we shouldn't know, sometimes we do know, which charges grand juries have rejected, not just in this administration, ever. So it's not a very high legal threshold, but there is a legal threshold. You can't bring in most grand juries a bogus charges with no evidence and get indictments. So we'll have to see what evidence they do. I know Glenn covered these too. We sat through so many hearings and trials in the last administration about presidential immunity, about how to appoint special counsels, the difference between a special counsel and a special prosecutor. And now they're like, Trump is kind of, to get a lot of these things done, will have to test his own legal precedent that he set in the last administration.
As prosecutors, Kristy and I have heard the allegation plenty of times prosecutors can, indict a ham sandwich. But we noticed that Bondi, what was it she served up? But we don't even know who the prosecutor is.
The one thing we were able to surface, and we did this a couple of days ago, is we don't think it's coming out of the Southern District of Florida, the U.S. Attorney's Office, but we think it's going to be venued there. So again, it's very unclear, and they may use the special attorney provision, but it appears that the venue that they're choosing is Southern Florida. But our sourcing in the U.S. Attorney's Office says it's not necessarily being routed through that. We reported that a couple of days ago. So the question is really, who are they going to get to do this? And to be honest with you, my general sense is that Bondi and company were just looking for a way to appease Trump and get this out of D.C., where it was a sure loser. So
is it your sense that Bondi's sitting in her office? She's obviously malleable. The phone rings, and Pam, what the hell? When you say appease, I mean, we heard about this remarkable, and they tried to cover it up, meeting that they would attend, a political strategy session, advances place about Maxwell. But what do you take to be? We knew before, when Kristy and I were there, never, ever, ever, except for one or two defined places, can there be any kind of communication. Do you have a sense of how it's actually working, that the marching orders are being communicated to the department, or does Bondi just know if it's an enemy, Trump will be happy with me? What's Bondi's stock like now? And how physically do the marching orders get transmitted, if they are indeed marching orders, as opposed to her best guesses about what the boss will like?
So my understanding is one of the big things people aren't really addressing is that, and I want to do this in sort of in a somewhat delicate way.
Mm-hmm.
Bondi and Blanche, her number two, are power sharing. Bondi is not a conventional attorney general. She's performative, and she doesn't have the general regard and power within the White House or access to Trump. She does have access to Trump, and she has access to Susie Wiles, the chief of staff. But it is my understanding that over the past few weeks, because of the bungling of the Epstein thing, is that Blanche has been given that portfolio. Another important conduit inside the Justice Department that people don't really focus on is a guy named Chad Mizell, who is the chief of staff, who was formerly the chief of staff at DHS, who is very, very close to Stephen Miller. A lot of stuff gets transmitted through Mizell. But here's the thing that is probably most problematic.
And he signs briefs. Stunning.
Signs
the
briefs.
Chief of Staff signing briefs.
So for instance, when we were talking about, when Kristy was talking about this complaint about the judge, about Boasberg, the language in that was very close to something Perry and I saw months earlier, when Chad Mizell drafted a similar complaint against another judge. So the language was virtually tracked very similarly. So it raises the question as to whether or not Mizell had a hand. Mizell also drafted a lot of those early first day memos that Bondi did. So there are a lot of cooks in this kitchen. But the point I want to make is that department, beyond those two conduits, there are dozens of other direct lines that White House people have into that building, some of which we know about, some of which we don't. There's never been anything like it. There's no gatekeeper whatsoever. So how does it get transmitted? We find out about it later. Typically, I would say, on some of the more consequential matters, it is Blanche either communicating with the president and then referring things back to Bondi. But Bondi does actually communicate directly with Trump himself.
I'm just wondering if you have a sense, either of you, of like, if there's any kind of broad worry just from self-interest. We had a big story in Glenn's paper about how you don't have that credibility or tailwind that Kristy and I were so used to appearing from the DOJ. Does anyone even give a shit about that just in terms of their own effectiveness?
I think there's definitely a realization that they need good prosecutors in this office. And these firings do not come without a cost. And, I think that it has been reported that there are discussions within DOJ to try to stop some of these firings. So I think they know they need good attorneys to argue these cases.
And so are you seeing action on the ground consistent with that? It is true that when Ruveni was there and, they had lawyer after lawyer saying, I don't know, really, really making fools of themselves. And I think they're making some effort. I don't know, Kristy, do you have an opinion here to appear professional? I'm not even sure because given the things they're doing, is any part of their overall agenda really turn on this? If it's completely turned over to just reprisal, misery, changing the narrative and making it all about the Democrats, what do they care if the laws go unenforced or not?
I just think back to, again, what I would always tell new AUSAs, your reputation before the court is something you need to safeguard. And you need to make sure when you go in before any judge, whether it's your case or you're covering for somebody else, that you are fully prepared and you are there anticipating any questions the judge may have. And if it's something you don't know the answer to, fall on your sword, say you don't know, say you'll get back to them. Always be respectful, always be as prepared as you can be, because you are going to be repeat players before these judges. They are going to know you. You're a reflection of the office. You have to be professional. All of these things, it feels like they've just gone out the window because now we see time and again, every court hearing, I don't know. And these are not judges asking gotcha questions that nobody could anticipate. They're asking the questions that even their orders say they are going to ask. And the lawyers are coming in unprepared. It's intentional. This is not incompetence. This is intentional. They're being told not to come in and to stonewall these judges. And again, it kind of comes back to, though, if there's not a consequence for that, if there's not a consequence where the judges can hold these attorneys in contempt, if there's not a consequence where the state bars and the attorney grievance committees can look at a set of facts and say, okay, we're going to impose some discipline. Just to give one example, looking at the Eric Adams case, that was a case where Judge Ho, yes, found, look, I don't have the authority here, so I have to go along with what the DOJ wants and dismiss this case. But tellingly, Bovee, during that hearing, said even if there had been a quid pro quo, even if there had been an exchange of, I'm going to drop this case in exchange for the political favor of helping immigration, even if that had been the case, you could still dismiss this case. It wouldn't be a problem. And the judge actually said in his opinion, yeah, that's a problem. That would be an abuse of prosecutorial power for political ends. That's not a thing you can be doing. It would be a grave betrayal of the public trust. You can't do those things. Okay, judge. But then what did the judge do? Did the judge say, I'm going to maybe have some fact finding on whether or not this kind of an explicit bargain actually happened? The judge says, no, I'm not going to look at it. And to me, that was such an abdication of responsibility there. I think he had not only the authority to look at it, but the responsibility to look at whether or not it affected the dismissal of the indictment. It affected whether or not there were prosecutors there who were acting in ways that were really violating, I think, the rules of professional conduct in New York in the way that they were behaving. And so I think that you want judges, I think, to look at those facts and then make any referrals to the state bars, to the attorney grievance committees, so that we can have some kind of accountability here.
And they're put in such humiliating positions. It's now time for our sidebar feature, which presents a brief account of important concepts in the current legal landscape, typically read by prominent persons from other fields. Today's sidebar topic is the Voting Rights Act. The landmark legislation celebrated its 60th birthday this past week, but it was something of a dampened celebration as its most important remaining provision is suddenly in the crosshairs of the U.S. Supreme Court. We did a sidebar on the act a couple years back, and we've asked the reader to return to explain the VRA and its slow erosion, and I'm really excited to welcome back Maggie Renzi. Renzi is an American film producer and actress. Her first film, Return of the Secaucus Seven, in which Renzi starred, managed, edited, and produced, won a Best Screenplay Award from the Los Angeles Film Critics Association. Her distinguished career since includes production work on Lone Star, Girl Fight, and a number of Bruce Springsteen music videos. I give you Maggie Renzi on the Voting Rights Act.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 celebrated its 60th anniversary this week. The VRA is widely regarded as the most effective civil rights statute in American history, and by many as the most successful piece of legislation in U.S. history. What is the Voting Rights Act and what does it do? And where does it stand today, 60 years later? The right to vote is perhaps the most fundamental and important right in democratic society. As the Supreme Court observed in 1886, voting preserves and protects all other rights. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Congress added the 15th Amendment to prohibit race-based voting discrimination. But despite the constitutional prohibition, systematic disenfranchisement of Black Americans continued, especially in the post-Reconstruction South. 100 years later, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act to try to more fully realize the Reconstruction Amendment's ideal of equal access to the ballot. The VRA became law in August 1965, 5 months after peaceful civil rights demonstrators were beaten, trampled, and tear-gassed in Selma, Alabama during a voting rights march. John Lewis was among those demonstrators. The Voting Rights Act employed several mechanisms to combat disenfranchisement. Many of those mechanisms have been chipped away through legal challenges with more threats on the horizon. The future of the VRA is cloudy at best. The most powerful enforcement tool in the Voting Rights Act was the federal pre-clearance process contained in Section 5. Under this process, states and localities that Congress determined had the worst records of voting discrimination had to obtain DOJ approval before making any voting changes. However, in a 2013 case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court dealt the first in a series of blows to the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court held that the pre-clearance formula was unconstitutional because, not having been updated in 40 years, it was untethered from current conditions, notwithstanding that Congress had approved its extension through 2030. In dissent in Shelby County, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued that throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Importantly, Shelby County would permit the pre-clearance process if Congress revises the formula. It's been more than a decade since the Shelby County ruling, and Congress has not done so. What remains of the Voting Rights Act is Section 2, which prohibits voting practices which result in a denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of race. Section 2 of the law is crucial because it enables civil rights groups and the Department of Justice to challenge discriminatory laws in court using the effects test. This test evaluates whether policies, even if they appear neutral on the surface, systematically disadvantage minority voters in practice. Without Section 5, Section 2 litigation is the last line of defense against discriminatory voting laws, but it's a far from perfect system. But Section 2 litigation is slow, expensive, and comes only after the damage is done. The burden of proof is high, and even when plaintiffs win, the remedies often come too late to effect an election. This last of defense, however, is staring down the barrel too. The Supreme Court just issued a procedural order in a redistricting case before them, Louisiana versus Calais. A lower court ordered Louisiana to redraw its map to add a second majority Black district to better reflect the state's Black population. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments this term but didn't decide the case. Instead, it ordered the parties to brief the following question: whether the state's intentional creation of a second majority-minority congressional district violates the 14th or 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And what does that mean? It means the Supreme Court is possibly poised to strike down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the last vestige of the once powerful tool in protecting the right to vote. If that happens, the country will be left with fewer and weaker mechanisms to protect the most fundamental right in our democracy. Before he died, civil rights pioneer John Lewis authored a statute that would reinvigorate Section 5 and enact a number of provisions tailored to present-day voting habits. The legislation passed the House a number of times, but each time, Republicans in the Senate defeated it through a filibuster. It remains to be dusted off if and when the U.S. government returns to a more sympathetic posture towards equal voting rights. For Talking Feds, I'm Maggie Renzi. I hope you'll look for my husband John Sayles' new novel, Crucible, which comes out January 2026. It's about oligarchy versus democracy in Detroit. Henry Ford is featured.
Thanks very much, Maggie Renzi. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we look at 3 different techniques for making rosé wine to see if there's truly a best way to rosé. First, rosé is a type of wine that's actually produced quite similarly to reds, but the fermentation time of the grape is reduced, giving rosé its signature pink color. The first technique for making rosé is the skin contact method, in which black-skinned grapes such as Pinot Noir are crushed but allowed to remain in contact with the juice for a short period of time. After about 6 to 48 hours, as opposed to weeks or months for the reds, the skins are separated. This method is most frequently used in the top rosé-producing region of the world, Provence, and throughout the south of France. The second method is called saignée, which is the French word for bleeding. This method creates both a rosé and a red wine. Early in the maceration process, some of the pink juice created from the grape must is removed to make the rosé, while the remaining juice becomes a more concentrated red. A rosé made from this method tends to be richer and darker in both color and fruit flavor. This method is more rarely used, but it can be found more often in rosés from Spain, Napa, and Chile. The third method is blending. Contrary to what some people think, blending is not just a 50-50 pour of red and white wine. Instead, blending is where a white grape, such as Chardonnay, is blended with a red grape, and it's the most popular way to make a rosé champagne. Although popular in Champagne, this method is used in still rosés as well. In fact, some winemakers in Provence choose to blend small percentages of white grape varieties into their rosés. It's not always obvious or easy to know which method was used to make a particular rosé, but the expert guides at Total Wine & More can help you navigate our wondrous selection to find a rosé that makes your day. So find what you love and love what you find, only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. All right, so Glenn and Perry, we're almost out of time, but I'm really trying to understand what the hell is going on inside the department in such extraordinary times. So let me do a sort of final question. I see is it Carolyn Levitt stand up for the White and just shamelessly say anything at all. Thank God you're developing internal sources, but is the official position of the department as you receive it just completely, as if it's all business as usual? And what do you mean these are politicized, etc.? Or is there some, official sense within there that, some weird shit is happening?
I think we can say what publicly has been said and what Caroline Leavitt has said and what Trump ran on, which is that they don't believe that the Justice Department operated normally in the past, and they believe that they are making right by it. And so, that is, you asked for the official line and what they are saying. So I don't think that these investigations are ones that, that they are doing through normal protocol, right? They got rid of the public integrity section and these safeguards. Obviously the line there has been that resources would be redistributed to the U.S. attorney's offices. We haven't seen that. But the point of the public integrity section was to ensure that there was a check. And that is a controversial section. People believe that check didn't always work, but I don't think they could argue against that they've really changed the way these big political investigations operate. But that is their line. That is what Caroline Leavitt has said. That is what we have received in statements, that they believe that this was a broken Justice Department, that they are turning the other side, whatever right or upside down side you thought it was before, they're turning it the other side.
I won't use your potty mouth description, but I think people do think that there is a lot of weird stuff going on. I think there is an acknowledgement internally that none of this is particularly normal. I also think the thing that people on the outside don't fully understand is the extent to which, and I think this is entirely reflective of the environment of the Trump administration, the extent to which people inside that building, and I'm talking about folks who are politicals, not career officials, people who are part of the Trump team, do not feel like they have agency and don't necessarily feel like they're in control of their own destiny, and in fact, don't necessarily think they're getting all the information. So this is a White House-centered administration. The Justice Department is arguably the agency that the White House wants to exert the most direct control of. So I think downstream, even when you're talking about people who are on Trump's team, they are feeling that as well. So I think the general feeling inside the building is that they are less empowered. And I'm not talking about career officials. I'm talking about Trump people.
And I'll just add, the alumni are totally consternated and distressed at all this. It drives you to potty mouth exclamations, but it feels to me, I see Kristy nodding, like really, really, really far beyond the pale, even more than I feared. We're out of time on this episode of Talking Feds. I think more to come on DOJ. Thanks so much, Perry and Glenn in particular, being first-time guests here. Kristy, good to see you. Everybody check out her new YouTube, and see you soon. Thank you so much to Kristy, Perry, and Glenn. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this episode. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes and my daily takes on top legal stories. Check us out as well on Substack at harrylitman.substack.com, where I'll be posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, breaking down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. And Talking Feds has joined forces with The Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to this bold new media venture, committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than editorial ones. Rest assured, we're still the same scrappy, independent podcast you've come to know and trust, just now linked up with an ambitious project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political discourse. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Luke Cregan and Katie Upshaw. Associate producer, Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. And production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Thanks very much to Maggie Renzi for explaining the Voting Rights Act and the dangers it faces from an upcoming Supreme Court case. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.